Afternoon, everyone. I'm Phil Togg. I've been working with 24/7 Prayer now since 2004, and it was in 2007, 2008 when we first heard stories of people who had experience of 24/7 prayer rooms, but were also either teachers or schools workers. They had some kind of involvement in schools, and they took the principles, the kind of core elements of what makes prayer rooms in churches great. So the creativity, the hospitality, the sense of everyone is welcome. There's kind of no expectations of a sort of understanding of prayer or reflection, and some of those core elements, and then put it into a school setting. And so the first prayer spaces that we heard about were in Gateshead in the north of England, Chichester on the south coast, Farnham in Surrey near London, and Colchester out in Essex as well. And I think we've got a photo. This is the first prayer space that I was involved with in November 2008. So this is in a high school, a secondary school. It's a small classroom that we got use of, myself and a couple of Methodist ministers. We were invited to take the use of this classroom for a whole week, and then students could come and visit this prayer space. This was only actually open during lunchtimes. Most of the prayer spaces in schools that have happened since then have been open during lesson times, and I'll come on to explain how that works as well a little bit later on. But this particular one was only open in lunchtimes. Now, my confession here is that by nature, I'm a bit of a skeptic. I generally think things aren't going to work until they do, and then I get very excited about them. And I have to confess that on the Monday morning, myself and Jamie and Ruth, the two Methodist ministers I was working with, we were sitting in this room. It was all beautifully decorated, as you can see there. There was a world map on the wall. There's a little, right in the middle of the picture, I don't know if you can see the words, but it kind of says, "Be yourself," on that sheet that's hanging precariously across the corner. I'll show you a little bit more detailed photo of that prayer activity a little bit later. In the left-hand corner, you'll see a "Be Still" zone. We've since used gazebos and tents. So there were zones around the room that we'd set up, and Jamie and Ruth and I sat in this room waiting for the lunch bell to go. And I genuinely thought, no one is going to come. We'd advertised it around the school. This was a community school. It's not a church school. So I honestly sat there thinking, why would any teenager want to come and spend their lunch hour in a prayer room in their school? And then the bell went, and within a few minutes, this room was full of teenagers. We reckon there had probably been about 100 teenagers in and out of that room in that first lunch hour. Thankfully, we didn't have to fill in a health and safety form, because I think we might have got in a bit of trouble. But it was crammed, it was noisy. There were pens being passed around and post-it notes on the floor, and sandwiches being eaten, and bags over shoulders, and it was just noisy. I remember one of the teachers looking through the door. I was standing pressed up against the wall, and she looked at me and she said, "It doesn't sound like there's much prayer going on in here." And to be honest, I didn't know what was going on in the room. It felt like I was running a youth club for that hour, that lunch hour. And eventually the bell went and all the students left, and Jamie and Ruth and I started picking up post-it notes and pens from the floor. And this is the first post-it note that I picked up. I don't know if you can read that. It says, "There are so many things I can't forgive myself for. I pray, I ask for your forgiveness, Lord." Now, I have no idea which teenager wrote that post-it note prayer and stuck it on the wall. I know that that teenager didn't do it on their own, because the room was full of people. There was no privacy at all. But clearly, whatever was going on in that young person's life was so close to the surface, was bothering them, was kind of creating tension, turmoil, and trauma in them so much that all it took was the invitation, a post-it note, a pen, the permission to try prayer And this is what they wrote. And for me, it was like a holy moment. It was the moment that I just knew that we have to do this. We have to find ways to create spaces of welcome, of hospitality, of holy spaces, sacred spaces, places of reflection and prayer for children and young people who may never get to walk through the doors of our local churches for all sorts of reasons. We need to take this model of welcome, of hospitality, of encounter with God into schools. So that's where it began for me. That's where I got really excited. This was the 5th prayer space in school that we were aware of. And since then, prayer spaces, over the last 13 years, prayer spaces have spread to more than 30 nations, schools in more than 30 nations we've heard stories from. They've been hosted indoors and outdoors. So this is one that I got to visit very recently in Bristol. It's an outdoor prayer space. I love the creativity here. Some schools have fantastic space outdoors like this. Others are inside. So this photo was from a prayer space in Ireland a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to read to you just briefly a bit of an email that we got sent from Hannah, who was working in a school. This was in a primary school. It was in a school for probably 6 to 11-year-olds in Northern Ireland, in Portadown. And this is what she wrote to us in an email. I've been running prayer spaces for a while now, and I know how important and impactful they are for kids, but I'd underestimated how transformative they can be in this season. So this is post, or in the kind of the aftermath of COVID. This school's been closed for months upon months, and children's lives, like our lives too, have been disrupted. And so she's acknowledging that prayer spaces have an important part to play, and we'll come back to that in a little while. After doing the various activities, she says, one of my least confident pupils, who would cry almost every day, said, "It's made me feel strong inside." Seeing the transformation in him when we went back to doing literacy was phenomenal. His experience in the prayer space changed something inside of him. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it incredible that an hour spent in a classroom with some bits of paper on a table and some post-it notes and some pens with the permission, the invitation to try praying, transforms a life, changes the outlook, the sense of hope, the sense of well-being in a child's life. And these photos that you've got in front of you now, these are from the first prayer space in a school that we're aware of in Switzerland. So this was in Gossau in Switzerland a little bit earlier this year. Marita, who's part of the Mums in Prayer network, ran this prayer space. So this is in a high school, it's in a secondary school. And she told us, we had a Zoom call with her, and she said she'd been praying for this school for 20 years. And had begun to wonder, what could, in her words, how could Holy Spirit work in this school? And so she felt inspired, she felt challenged to go and speak to the religion teacher in this school. And the religion teacher said, ask the Holy Spirit what you should do in the school. And it was at that point that she read a book called Red Moon Rising, about 24/7 prayer, and she got inspired about prayer rooms. And thought, I wonder if we could do a prayer space in the school. And so she went back to the school and suggested it. And very quickly it came to this point where she got to host the very first prayer space that we're aware of in Switzerland. And this is what she wrote to us in an email earlier this year. The peace in the prayer space was strong. Even the people who didn't believe in God could feel it. The students' behavior improved and many deep conversations were had. Some students said it was the best experience of religion. And another student wrote that they prayed for the very first time and it felt good. Can you just imagine the party in heaven when that kind of reflection, that kind of response was taking place? And don't forget, this is a classroom. This isn't a church camp. This isn't a festival. There's no worship band. There's no great preacher going on. There's no smoke machine, no DJ. There's no cool stuff going on. This is a classroom hosted by local volunteers, by Christians, with some creative stuff and that invitation to try praying if you want to. There's no pressure to this. Children and young people, they are invited to come and use the activities in a way that is meaningful for them. But our observation over these last 13, 14 years is that there's something within the children's and young people's lives. Well, it's within all of us, isn't it? There's that ache, there's that yearning to be reconciled, to reconnect, to make sense of life, to find hope and purpose and meaning. And I think it's like the activities are creating the bridge, the connection for them to try praying, perhaps for the first time in their lives. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of photos in a moment of different prayer activities and some of the responses that children and young people have made to these activities. We're going to spin through these images quite quickly, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But what I wanted to point you towards before we get into that is the Prayer Spaces in Schools website. It's been fully redesigned over the course of this past year, and there are probably 150 different prayer activities on there. There are dozens of stories. The stories of both of the two prayer spaces I've mentioned now in Ireland and Switzerland are on the website. And there's all sorts of other really practical details about how to get started. If you're in Germany, there's a German version of the website. If you're in Austria, there's an Austrian version. There's a Maltese version of the website, and we're working on some others. We've got dreams and schemes for others at the moment. But our hope is that you can find everything that you need to really get started with the best possible prayer space on these websites. And if you can't, send us an email, because your questions are probably questions that someone else has asked or someone else is asking, and we will do our absolute best to help you find answers so that you can host the best possible prayer spaces where you are. So, having done that, let me just show you this. I don't know if any of you have been involved in crafting a mission statement or a vision statement at some point or other. What a joy it is to spend hours and hours trying to write one sentence. That's how long it took us to come up with these two simple sentences, which I'm going to read to you. Prayer spaces, this is what we believe prayer spaces are there for. They're there to enable children and young people of all faiths and none, that's really, really important, to explore spirituality, faith, and life's big questions in a safe and a creative and an interactive way. And I think you'll see all the elements of that sentence as we scroll through some of the photos in a moment. As a kind of ministry, as part of 24/7 prayer, we believe that Prayer Spaces in Schools' mission is to equip the church. Prayer Spaces in Schools, we don't run prayer spaces. Local churches need to run prayer spaces in partnership with their local schools. Sometimes schools run them on their own. Sometimes it's students within the schools that run them. It kind of depends on the national context, the education system. The nature of relationships between churches and schools is different in different nations, as I'm sure you're aware. And so there's always a way. This is the thing. Often people say it can't be possible in this school. That is exactly how I felt in 2008. But the proof has been over the years that it is possible. And perhaps more so now, there is a recognition of the need of spaces of reflection, of processing pain, of reflecting on grief and gratitude, and of figuring out what do we believe spiritually and how do we connect with God. Perhaps there's more of a space and a demand for that than ever before. So, having seen that, I want to show you one more slide in terms of sort of overview of prayer spaces. Actually, I'm going to flick on to this next one, which is a slightly better way of understanding it. We designed all the prayer activities around these four areas. We want prayer spaces to help children and young people love themselves, to kind of receive themselves, to accept themselves. if you're working with children and young people, you know what a battle that is. And social media doesn't help. It kind of exacerbates that that pressure on children and young people to present a self that is not themselves, to present a better version of themselves. And we dearly want to help children and young people to love themselves as they are, because God does. And so some of the activities are to do with loving myself. Some of them are to do with loving others. Some of them are to do with restoring and healing broken relationships. They're to do with how I relate to others. Some of them are to do with how do I love the world? How do I respond to injustice in the world? How do I pursue peace in the world? How do I respond to environmental issues and climate injustice, all of those kind of things? How do I fulfill that Genesis calling to be a good steward in the world? That is part of our spiritual calling, to love the world. And then finally, it's some of the activities are to do with how do I connect with God? How do I learn to love God? So here we go. Let's flick through some examples. Some of the activities about me and myself. There's almost always an activity to do with being still. It could be a gazebo or a tent or a sort of sheeted off area, somewhere that invites children and young people to pause. What I found fascinating in the years of running prayer spaces is almost always this is the zone, this is the activity that children and young people love best. I would never have guessed that in a kind of entertainment obsessed culture that we live in, where children and young people are rarely still. They are constantly stimulated with new experiences, new ideas, new apps, new opportunities to do things. I kind of assumed that children and young people wouldn't be attracted to stillness. I've dispensed with that now, because I've become convinced that children and young people, perhaps like us as adults, we actually crave stillness. We just don't know how to do it. And so there are very deliberately some activities in our library, on the website, that are to do with being still. And there's an invitation, there's the permission to be still and perhaps know that God is God and we are not. I mentioned the be yourself zone, very simple. Mirrors sort of stood up or hanging up, affixed to a wall, maybe some quotes from the Bible or from popular songs. You are beautiful no matter what they say. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. And then some instructions or a question that says something like, what if these statements were more true than the statements that you hear and feel in your head about yourself? It's fascinating how many children and young people who come away from activity like this walking a little bit taller, seeing themselves, saying they've never quite looked at themselves in that way before. This stuff is really valuable. Why? Because of this. This was a teenager in a school that I went to run a prayer space in. This was their feedback. I need help. I feel like I am always crying inside. This is probably the kind of summary that I feel describes children and young people these days more than anything else. Me on the outside, a smiley face. Me on the inside, I'm broken, I've got questions, and I don't know who to talk to about this. Prayer spaces provide a little bit of an outlet. We did a series of prayer spaces up in the north of England across a number of high schools all at the same time, and the executive head teacher of that series of schools made this comment, which I found fascinating. It's nothing we have done has had a bigger impact on student well-being than this. And so they've built prayer spaces into the annual rhythm of life in the school. Some of the feedback I get at the end of prayer space is amazing. It made me feel good about myself. How about this? I liked everything because it let me open myself and be me, not be something that's not me. What an extraordinary bit of kind of self-awareness this was a boy, a young man, had about himself. I've realized that most of the time I'm not me, but when I was here for this hour in this creative classroom with these post-it notes and torn up cardboard and that invitation to reflect on my life and maybe pray, I felt like that was me. What a gift that is for him. Yeah, just imagine the uproar in heaven in that moment. Maybe he left without any great revelation about who God is. I'm still convinced there was uproar in heaven. Why? Because he had learned to love himself just a little bit more. And surely that's the beginning of allowing others, maybe God, to love him too. So some of the activities about relationships, there's almost always something about being sorry, saying sorry to others. I don't know if you can read this. There's a slight spelling adjustment may be needed here. It actually says, I am sorry for fighting my sister, which I absolutely love. Very sweet primary school student. Sometimes you don't quite know whether to mourn and grieve with someone's sorry or have a little chuckle. I'm sorry for not looking after my hamster properly. He died. I really liked that student put, he died. It's like, just in case you don't know, God, we didn't do too well. But there's always moments of humour as well in prayer spaces. And I've found one of the most powerful themed activities, and there's quite a few in the prayer space in schools library, is forgiveness. Forgiveness stones is one of the examples. This activity has a short narration that students listen to. It lasts about 2 minutes, and it leads them through some reflection on things that people have done and said that they are kind of carrying within themselves like a stone. This girl is holding a stone in her hand, and there's the invitation, if you want to, there's no pressure to this, if you want to, if you feel ready to begin to let go, to forgive, place the stone in the bowl of water that's in front of you. It's just off the picture in front. I've sat with students watching them put the stones back on the pile of stones, which they're perfectly okay to do. I'm not ready to let go. I don't know how to let go. I'm not ready to forgive. I've lost count of the number of times I've seen those same students come back on another occasion the next day during a lunchtime or a break time and say, Bill, can I have another go at that activity? Because I want to do it. I'm ready to let go. And I've watched students weeping as they place that stone in that bowl of water. My wife and I, we've got 3 daughters, and there was a point a few years ago where we realised we've been quite good at, we think, in encouraging our daughters to say sorry. We've perhaps been less good at encouraging them to forgive. Forgiveness is the harder work, isn't it? But so profoundly important. It's a chunk of the Lord's Prayer itself. Jesus himself makes clear that forgiveness is important. It's good for us, and it helps us to restore, to reconcile relationships too. I love this bit of reflection at the end of a prayer space. This was in a high school. A teenager wrote, I forgave someone the other day in here, and today we're mates. Why? Because this student did an activity in the prayer space, and then they clearly went and became their prayer. They prayed a prayer, but then they needed to go and reconcile. And we see this over and over again. It was like the creative activity is a half step, a first step. I'm making a little bit of movement, and now I feel the prompting of the Holy Spirit, the confidence, the courage to go and do the extra work of reconciliation with someone else. Amazing. This is fascinating as well. The forgiveness table was weird because I felt funny when tearing it up. I remember the student who wrote this. Something happened. She experienced something in her body. Holy Spirit did something in her. And there are lots of occasions when children and young people experience something of the presence of God, whether they understand what is actually going on or not. There's something happens that becomes a tangible memory for them. It becomes a moment of encounter that may take them a day or a month or a year or longer to process and make sense of, but something happened for them. I've put this in just to give you an example of prayer spaces in other locations. If you think your location is going to be impossible, just consider this for a moment. There was a French missionary working in the Congo. she had this big warehouse building. She's working particularly with abandoned girls. And they had a kind of orphanage-like setup, a home for these abandoned girls. No electricity here at all, but just had this big warehouse building. And we had a conversation with her when she travelled to a local city and had a Zoom call. I think it was Skype back then. And we had this conversation with her. It's like, oh, I don't have a bubble tube. I don't have a world map. I don't have a gazebo. I do have some plastic chairs and I have some branches of trees and I've got some paper and pens. And we were like, you can do a prayer space. You don't need all the high-tech stuff. Just use what you've got. And so she set up this really simple prayer space. And then she sent us this email afterwards. One of the activities she wrote was to pray for those who need help. And to my surprise, most of these abandoned girls prayed for the parents who had abandoned them. For me, it was a good lesson in forgiveness. God's love reaches the hearts of his children who have been hurt and gives them strength and love to forgive like him. I was humbled. What an incredible bit of feedback. So nothing's impossible wherever you are. So sometimes prayer spaces include an activity around grief, and this is a simple one that's been used in lots of settings. It's called the empty chair, as you can see, and it's really simply this: where is the empty chair around the table of your life? It might be someone who you have loved and lost. It might be someone who has moved away, a grandparent that you no longer see, or maybe it's a pet, maybe it's a significant personality, a significant person, an animal, someone that you've loved that's no longer around. Often we found, and I'm sure you found this too, is that children and young people who are grieving, especially if they know that their parents are grieving too, they don't necessarily talk about their grief because they don't want to add their grief, their struggles onto others in the home. And so often children and young people don't know what to do with that struggle in their own life. And so activities like this can be an extraordinary outlet. I'm going to rush on because we have about 14 minutes left to go. I'd love to leave a few minutes for some questions. So moving on, praying for the world. We really try and encourage every prayer space to use activities that are to do with the world, issues of injustice. Out there, lots and lots of different ways to do that. Here in England, lots of prayer spaces have used this one, Lifeboat Prayers. It was only a few summers ago that our TV screens were full of images of refugees, immigrants coming across the English Channel. Sadly, so many not making it across, crowded, overfull lifeboats. And so a school in East Anglia near Norwich had come up with this idea, put a big inflatable lifeboat in the classroom and then invited students to write prayers on little luggage tags and tie it to them. Their hopes, their wishes, their longing, their prayers for those that were risking their lives. Prayers against injustice. There's another example, it's to do with homelessness. So children, young people can crawl inside these cardboard boxes and they're invited to imagine, what if this was home for you? What if this was home and it was on a street corner? What a difference that would be to your bedroom. If you want to, why don't you write your hope, your wish, your prayer for those for whom this is home onto the cardboard box, and you can see some of the things that are scribbled there. Oh, I've got a few examples here. This was from a primary school. Sad, one of the children has written. Lonely. It's a squeeze. I like this one, bottom middle. Get me a pillow or a duvet. A very practical prayer there. And then the sort of final area is this connection with God. What do we believe about God? My favorite prayer activity in a prayer space is simply this, big questions. And usually I like using torn up cardboard because I like the kind of roughness of it. It'll be a table with some blank torn up cardboard, and the instructions will say something like, whether you believe in God or not, imagine God is sitting at the table here. What's the one question that you would love to ask God if you could? And it's fascinating, the questions that children and young people ask. Lots of them are kind of head questions. They're theology. I don't understand. How can God listen to everyone's prayers all at once? Or does everyone go to heaven? These are big questions. Some of them could be head questions. They could be kind of heart questions. They could be compassion questions. I love this. It's kind of feisty. It's got a bit of bite to it, isn't it? You allow wars. Why? And in case God needs to understand the difference of the impact of war and no war, this young person has drawn some little smiley faces and sad faces to point out the difference in people's experience of war. And I'm sure God got the point. Lots of the responses are heart questions. They're suffering questions. They are longing questions. They are why questions. Why did God let my granddad die? Here's a beautiful little letter that someone wrote. I think there should be a me after the word forgive. Forgive me for what I've done. I want friendship back in my heart because right now it's empty. Thank you. These are children and young people looking for reconciliation, looking for connection. This bits of feedback we get that are just mind-blowing and exciting. I feel closer to God. I feel now closer to God. I don't know what happened for that young person, but something happened. There was an encounter. There was something in their time, the minutes they spent in that prayer space, in their school classroom, which meant the statement they made at the end of that time was, I actually feel closer to God. Something happened for me. I love this. I don't know if you can read it clearly. This was written by a 9-year-old girl, 9 or 10-year-old girl. And she said, it was really fun. That's a good start, isn't it? I don't know how many of our children and young people would say that about church, but I'm really glad that this young girl wrote this about a prayer space. It was really fun. It made me see God everywhere I look. I don't know about you, but that's the aspiration of my life. I want to see God everywhere I look. And for whatever reason, this is what this young girl said about her experience. And then she goes on to say, God has spoken to me. Wow. What a gift that little bit of time was in the prayer space. Very occasionally, we get little bits of feedback like this. So this came through on Twitter. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter. I've kind of given up on Twitter. But we received this tweet. And if you know anything about Twitter, you'll know that there's only a certain amount of characters that you can send in a tweet. And so we received this tweet. Hi, thanks to you all for your amazing ideas. Pupil has had a bad skin rash, allergies for 2 weeks. He walked in with a rash, prayed on her, and that was the end of the tweet. And so we had to sit there waiting for the second half, for the second tweet to come through. And this is what it said. Prayed on her, post it for it to go as it made him feel sad. He left with no rash. Miracle? Coincidence? Who knows? But he's a very happy boy. That little boy, nobody prayed for him. He wrote on a post-it note. I don't know what he wrote on that post-it note. I don't like this rash. God, can you get rid of my rash? But something happened in the course of a few minutes that he left with no rash. These are moments of encounter. And there's nothing coercive about this. There's nothing pushy about it at all. There's an invitation. Just like Jesus, he invited the crowd, just come and taste and see. You're welcome. Come whether you have faith or not. I'm not really bothered about how you see me. Just come because I love you. And that's the sense of hospitality that we long for and what we're loving seeing happen in prayer spaces. It's setting up some simple activities that help children and young people connect with the big questions of their life, things that they're wrestling with in their own lives, in their relationships with others, their questions about the world, their questions about God. There's no pressure to it, but there's an invitation. And over and over and over again, in countless prayer spaces, more than 5,000 of them over this last 13 years, we know that more than 1 million children and young people have experienced these prayer spaces already in their schools, in these 30 plus nations. They are encountering the presence of God. Something is happening where they know they've experienced God. And this is the invitation that we have. Prayer spaces have all sorts of impact. And I think in different nations, I know we've got friends from South Africa here on the call. I'm not sure where the rest of us are, but what we found over the years is that we needed to think carefully and wisely about how do we describe prayer spaces? How does a prayer space serve different education systems in different countries? Here in England, that big long line in the middle, spiritual, moral, social and cultural learning, is a key part of the education system here. So every school, whether they're a church school or a community school, are expected to provide spiritual, moral, social and cultural learning. Prayer spaces tick all those boxes. So it's very easy for churches in England and in Wales as well to say to local schools, we would love to serve you and help you to fulfill some of the things that the government expects you to fulfill with this simple model. It will help you tick some boxes and it will do so much more. It'll help you with the pastoral life of your school. It'll help your staff as well. It'll help parents too. So in different nations, what's been important is for us to pray and talk with school staff and try and figure out how does this fit into the school system. You'll see in the bottom right hand corner that phrase trauma-informed practice. That's a kind of buzz phrase in America right now. Schools in America recognizing that, I suppose as we are in many nations, that children and young people are traumatized. They're traumatized by all sorts of things. It might not be big deal stuff, but we all struggle with the trauma of anxiety and unfulfilled expectations, disappointments, grief, and all this kind of things, the pressures of life. And we need practice that helps with that meets those needs. And so we're wondering whether prayer spaces might fit into that language. So we need some wisdom and some good, healthy conversations about how to articulate prayer spaces. But I'm convinced there's always going to be a way, and that's the challenge for us. Last couple of slides. There's loads more details about this on the website. Go and pray, explore the websites, visit a prayer space if you can. We can probably help you with that. Relationships between school and local churches or Christian organisations or with students are a key bridge on which to carry this prayer space idea into a school. The team hosting, whoever that is, whether that's school staff or local volunteers, is critical. Rooms aren't hospitable, people are hospitable. And so it's that the magic happens when you've got great people hosting rooms full of great activities. And let us know when you do prayer spaces.